The Shaping of Gondor, Part 3, The Line of Eärnil. Chapter 4, Regency. Succeeding Atanatar II was his eldest son Narmakil, and under him the decline of Gondorian governance continued unabated. The new king quickly proved himself every bit as much of a do-nothing as the old, and indulged in all of his father's immoral habits. In only one way did Narmakil's rule mark an improvement over that of his predecessor. Although without children himself, no doubt due to his lifelong overindulgence in wine and rich food, he had a nephew who more than made up for his own shortcomings. This was Minalcar, the son of Narmakil's enfeebled younger brother. Minalcar was as hard-working, decisive, and intelligent as his uncle, father, and grandfather were lethargic and uncaring, and as early as 1196 had begun accumulating offices, as well as taking the field against the Easterlings in Rhovanion. This was a fortunate turn, for the latter, after an interlude of 4 centuries, were becoming restive and covetous of the fruitful lands to the west, something made all the more dangerous in light of the negligence of the uncaring Atanatar II. Their activities started as small raids, but soon became much more serious, as it became evident that there were to be no concerted reprisals from Osgiliath and its pleasure-loving court. To be sure, an exceptionally vicious raid on Rhovanion in 1232 partially succeeded in shaking the torpid King Narmakil out of his idleness. At least, he took the measure of assembling a retaliatory force and placing it under the supremely capable generalship of Minalcar. Eastward the prince marched, and dealt swiftly with the encroachers, defeating them soundly in 2 short battles. It took a further 3 years, however, to thoroughly expel them from the hinterlands of the Sea of Rhûn, and reinforce Gondor's supremacy along its shores. 2 years later, in 1237, the situation became still more complicated, when the king was stricken by an illness of the mind of some sort, perhaps brought on by his gluttonous eating and drinking. It soon became obvious to all that Narmakil was incapable of ruling, and the steward Valimir, along with a number of other high members of the court, arranged to offer Minalcar the position of regent. A hasty council of the realm was summoned, and rapidly concurred. The need for a transfer of authority was paramount for the sake of the continuation of steady governance. The incapacitated Narmakil was also persuaded, in one of his lucid moments, to agree to this, and in Narquelier of 1240, Minalcar was duly invested as ruling regent of Gondor. He became king in all but name. After nearly a century of impotence, the government of the realm was thus at last put back in steady hands, and Minalcar quickly set about undoing the damage inflicted by his predecessor's misrule. First and most importantly, funds were allocated to the rearmament and enlargement of Gondor's armies, particularly those positioned in the vulnerable northern and eastern provinces. The main royal army was also received a much-needed infusion of new conscripts. A new discipline was also supplied, for Minalcar was no stay-at-home monarch in the mold of Atanatar II or Narmakil, but instead made a point of personally inspecting his legions on a regular basis. This was fortunate, for he was not to have the easy reign he deserved. To the east, the Gondorian hold on Dorwinion, eastern Rhovanion, and the lands around the Sea of Rhûn had grown shaky at best under the careless rule of Atanatar and Narmakil, and now Easterling tribes were making threatening motions towards them. These were not the same Easterlings that Osterher, Romendikil, and Turambar had fought 7 centuries before, being descended of a different and somewhat more civilized lineage, for proximity to Gondor and her provinces had given them a varnish of refinement which their predecessors had lacked. Nonetheless, civilization had not slaked their appetite for spoils and tribute, and so war gradually loomed ever closer as the years passed. As we have seen, Minalcar had already tested himself against these marauders on the field as a younger prince. Now, as regent, he fully devoted himself to their expulsion from Gondor's eastern lands for good. He knew his accession to power had only delayed, not stopped the barbarian strike against Rhovanion. Therefore, all possible preparations were made, garrisons were strengthened, granaries were replenished, walls and ramparts were repaired, and roads were refurbished. These measures were taken none too soon, for in 1245, 5 years into the Regency, the long anticipated attack took place. A vast force of Easterling warriors flooded into eastern Rovanion, and only the garrisons and fortifications put into place by Minalcar prevented the entire land from being overrun then and there. The regent himself happened to be in Calenarthon at the time, but he lost no time in marching towards the east with all speed. During the ensuing war, a number of small skirmishes occurred, none of which resulted in decisive results for either side, for the Easterling tribes had retained all their old slipperiness, and would offer no open fight at first. Nevertheless, though it took a few years to fully find his footing against the invaders, Minilcar proved more than a match for the tribal hordes. In Urme of 1248, he managed to corner the main Easterling force, under their formidable chief, Ertigar, on a particularly barren stretch of terrain in East Rovanion, known as the Seer. Here the barbarians were utterly defeated, and sent fleeing, mostly due to Ertigar's reliance on furious charges in the face of Minilcar's carefully organized maniples. It was a total Gondorian victory, and with it not only was her hold on Rovanion confirmed, but it was proven to all of Middle-earth that Gondor was still a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. Ertigar was rapidly deposed and assassinated by one of his own minions forthwith. Following his victory, Minilcar remained in the east for a further year, mopping up the lingering traces of Easterling presence there, as well as shoring up the border defenses. Only in 1249 did he make his return to a jubilant Osgiliath after an absence of 4 years. In that same year, Minilcar made the surprising decision to relinquish all claim to the land of Dunland, where Hjarmindikil had died a century before, and which had been his final conquest. In the regent's judgment, this only made sense. The province was thinly populated, difficult to defend, and badly exposed to the wild mountain men and the marauders of Cardolan to the west. Thus, after almost exactly a century at her maximum extent, Gondor began her long border pullback, which was to last for 8 centuries thereafter. The following year, Minilcar took an even more fateful measure. Fighting alongside Gondor at the Battle of the Seer in 1248 had been Vidugavia, king of the Northmen. His people occupied a region just to the west of the Sea of Rhun and north of Rovanion. Therefore, the kingdom was referred to by some as North Rovanion to distinguish it from the larger Rovanion which Gondor ruled. Vidugavia's aid had proved invaluable during the war against the Easterlings, and had gone a long way toward clinching the victory against the latter. Naturally, then, Minilcar, following that victory, had eagerly brokered a permanent alliance with the Northmen, in gratitude for their assistance, as well as out of recognition of their usefulness as a bulwark against the Easterlings. To seal this alliance, the regent sent his youthful son, Valacar, to the court of Vidugavia, at his chief stronghold of Freilig, as his ambassador. The son performed this role capably enough, but it had an unintended consequence. Vidugavia, as it happened, had a lovely daughter named Vidumavi, and the young Gondorian princeling quickly found himself in love with her. After a few years, the pair sought their royal father's consent to marry, and probably against his better judgment, Minilcar agreed to the union in 1254. The next year, Vidumavia gave birth to a son named Vinitharia in the northern tongue. When in 1260 Valacar was recalled home by his father, his wife and young son accompanied him, where the latter was christened with the Gondorian name of Eldikar. This marriage and the birth of this particular princeling was to have immense bearing on the course of events 2 centuries later, and was to eventually lead to the most tragic war Gondor was ever to fight. But all of that lay in the future. For the moment, Minilcar seemed to have the touch of effortless victory, like the ship kings before him. As wise and diligent an administrator as he was skilled as a general, Gondor underwent a new flowering under his able hand. Although his augmentation of the armies placed a considerable burden on the royal treasury, Minilcar and his ministers were nimble enough in the art of checking and balancing expenditures that taxes were kept at a reasonable level, and even decreased on certain portions of the populace. Of course, this only further enhanced Minalcar's popularity among his subjects. The increase in the border garrisons turned out to be well advised, when in 1263 Orcish and Mannish bands from Mirkwood suddenly issued out of the fortress of Dol Guldur and into western Rhovanion in an attempt to raid the Brownlands. To be sure, they were defeated and sent scurrying back with little trouble by the king's soldiers stationed at the southern boundary of the forest, but the incursions kept coming in steady intervals for some 30 years. The damage and destruction these encroachers might have wrought on the peoples of these lands would likely have been far more savage had not these border defenses existed, a fact not lost on the Rhovanion and its grateful tenants. It was around this time that whispers began to spread of a mysterious shadow, resurgent out of the far past, that had taken hold in Mirkwood to threaten Gondor as well as the other peoples of Middle-earth. In 1275 the regent commissioned the monument by which he is best remembered down to our own day. At the northern border of Calenarthon, which then marked the northernmost extremity of Gondor's empire, Minalcar had work begun on a pair of colossal monoliths in the form of Isildur and Anarion, the founders of the Gondorian realm. Known as the Argonath, the figures were each well over 300 feet tall and carved out of the living stone of a pair of overhanging cliffs on either side of the Anduin River. They were not completed till 1310, and there they still stand today, as an everlasting reminder of their builder's majesty, as well as the strength and glory of the kingdom he ruled over. Meanwhile, in 1294 King Narmakil, still mad, died after an entirely undistinguished reign of 68 years. Like Taranon Falister, he left no children, and with his death came an end to the line of Ernil.